I thought about this presentation in a slightly different way. So it's not necessarily about how can we use blockchain in the field of construction of urban planning, but rather I wanted to share with you, based on my experience and expertise, how you can navigate the negotiations you need to have with the government when you are working on either construction or urban planning, and actually how can blockchain be an ally on those negotiations. So I'm going to be focusing a lot about what are the main bottlenecks that we find usually when we are having those negotiations with the government and we're trying to actually implement or leverage on blockchain. And I hope that you find useful these like practical case studies that I'm going to bring and share so that you can actually apply it to your work. As Abel mentioned, the title of this presentation is how we can collaborating at chain speed, trust frameworks for public-private blockchain partnerships. And my name, Ana Grijalva. So let me tell you very briefly, what are you going to be hearing about? I was head of a very large project run by the United Nations, specifically UNDP, which stands for United Nations Development Program. So this large project was actually working in like 3 big regions. So we had Middle East and North Africa, MENA region, we had Eastern Europe, and then we also had Latin America and the Caribbean. So what we were trying to do within the UN was actually to support our country offices on each of these countries across these regions and see how we can help them in those negotiations with the government in the ongoing projects that the government of those countries already had with UNDP, and try to see how some of those negotiations could actually leverage a lot with blockchain and get better, stronger, and smarter projects and actually results. So that is the framework of the work that I'm going to tap on to actually bring these insights and reflections to you all. So today we're going to be discussing 3 things. So the first one would be how we can bridge knowledge gaps. I'm going to share what are the tactics that we deploy for that, how you can be unblocking institutional barriers and strategies around that. And finally, I'm going to share, I'm going to also be critical about what I said before and wrap up with a few reflections and recommendations that I hope that brings us all to have a great discussion. So being said that, I'm going to be focusing on 2 case studies, mainly from the region where I belong from, which is Latin America and the Caribbean. And the results that I am about to share with you all are literally from early this year. So it's like right out of the oven. Being said that, I'm going to start by sharing what were the bridges in terms of knowledge that we face and how we were able to use tactics to go around them in those negotiations with the government. And whoever is on the other side of the negotiation with the government, it can be academia, it can be other big international organizations. It could also be like the private sector for sure, because especially in construction and urban planning, there is a weight and important role of the private sector. So this literally applies for whoever else is on the other side of this negotiation. Does not necessarily have to be from the UN, but is rather like who is negotiating with the government in terms of using blockchain to leverage on their working on. So let me share with you, we're going to start like on a road trip through Latin America and the Caribbean. Our first stop is El Salvador, which is in Central America. And I'm going to share with you how we were supporting the government to actually leverage on blockchain. So what you see right now is like the beautiful natural reservations that El Salvador has, like protected natural areas. And actually, the government had an issue because they were underfunded to actually protect nature. So they were thinking which other sources of funding I could actually tap on so that I can have more resources to protect my natural parts. So for that, what the government initially thought is, what if I tokenize environmental services, and therefore through the sale of those tokens, I could actually raise funds. So that was the initial idea of the government. They call UNDP to actually support them in this task, and that's how I end up working with this issue and this particular country and government. So what were the main knowledge gaps that we face based on that initial government idea? The knowledge gaps we were discussing with the teams that were involved in the ideation and planning on how this project could look like is that there were a few expectations from the government that did not necessarily held true the entire time. Let me tell you what those were. So first, the government was thinking, okay, so since I am tokenizing environmental services, that means that automatically I'm going to have more funds. And that was like the first misconception or knowledge gap that you face usually when you're talking about selling tokens and like fundraising through these other mechanisms that are leveraging on blockchain. The second problem we had is that the government was expecting that because we're bringing blockchain into the equation, therefore we could tap on external oracles as well as the smart contracts. And it was just going to be like almost automatic to understand how you can measure environmental services and assets. And then the third one is that, of course, some of the pressure put on these natural areas was because of the communities that are surrounding the areas and live around it. Sometimes they do illegal logging or they use the forest in different ways that is not necessarily for the benefit of its preservation. So again, here the government was expecting that since we sell the tokens, then we have more funds and that can be translated directly and very quickly to the communities. So those were the three big knowledge gaps that the government had in terms of how they were expecting blockchain to actually work and leverage on these various levels of the problem, as you can tell. So you have the economical problem related with we're expecting to fundraise more, then you have more of the policy making problem on how you can really measure environmental assets, and then of course like the entire community-based relationship that the government needed to have with those communities that were surrounding natural areas. So what did we do is that we had like very long conversations and we were like demystifying how actually blockchain is just a technology, it's not going to be like the whole solution package to tackle those various levels of problems that the government was bringing to the table. And we wanted to make sure that the results of the use of this technology actually had an accurate match with the expectations of the government. So in that sense, we clarify that, yes, blockchain does bring transparency. That's going to be good for new investors while we're selling tokens, but it is not going to translate necessarily into more funding more quickly. We need to think ahead how that investment strategy would look like. How are we going to convene new investors? Why would this be interesting for them? What are they gaining from this? So all of those big questions we needed to put on the table and help out the government to just realize that it was not going to be automatic just because it's transparent. It's not going to be more funding necessarily. The second conversation we had is that to actually measure environmental assets is very complicated. And of course, blockchain does bring the capacity of bringing information to the chain through oracles. And we have smart contracts. So once we bring that information to the chain, everything goes by pretty automatically. But to bring that information on the chain, you actually need to take decisions in terms of how you want to measure the benefits and advantages that nature is bringing. And the third one is that we suggested that they should also take care of like these relationships with the communities that were the closest to the forest, because of course, even if they have the additional fund and they were trying to understand how the money would like directly go from blockchain to the community so it doesn't have to happen or go through the government. That is doable, but again, it's not just a matter of how you make the transaction. It's like the entire context of how you can enable that transaction so that it makes sense and that people is ready to actually make use of it. So those were the challenges and the gap knowledge that we needed to discuss. The tactics that we use around this, and I can totally see this working for urban planning and infrastructure as well, is that we invited the government to be co-designing with us, meaning that they needed to actually also understand and be part of the token economic model that they wanted to put in place, so that actually they could teach this and elevate the strategy to an investment strategy for it and try to convene new investors. The validation side, we clarified that it was important for them to have a broader partnership, especially with academia, trying to understand how they're going to measure all of these natural resources. And then the third one is to include, especially, and I think this applies perfectly as well for urban planning and construction, because it's on the territory. So it means that it is like people will be the key element of the equation of whatever you're doing on that piece of land. And here you need to use other strategies on how you're going to approach them and how you are going to build a bigger strategy besides whatever the benefit of using technology such as blockchain is bringing to the community. What is the bigger strategy of that relationship and those effective mechanisms of communication? So those are the tactics that we used. And now I'm going to jump to the second part of our trip. So we're going to keep going further down through Latin America and the Caribbean. And in this second city or country that we're about to visit, which is Argentina on the south of the continent, I would like to share with you what were the main institutional barriers that we face. And I was reflecting a lot how this would be useful for the audience that works on urban planning and construction. And definitely most of the negotiations with you either construct or plan are with the government. So I think that definitely this is relevant material for the work that you're currently doing. So in that sense, let me share with you what was happening in Argentina. In Argentina, the government had the following idea. They were saying, okay, we have community centers located around different boroughs in Buenos Aires. And usually the government will send money to the community centers, and then community centers will offer services to the different households located in that borough. That is how the model worked. And they were thinking, what if we change how the model works? And this is the idea of that transition. So instead of the government sending the money to the community center, they were saying, we're not going to send it to the community center, but instead we're going to send it to the households directly, that money. So the households have the capacity to decide which community center service is better tailored to my needs, my family structure, and whatever I'm needing. So under that logic, that's why the government wanted to bring blockchain and actually ensure that they were able to track how the money was arriving, how it was being spent. So I just shared with you what was the problem. The problems the government had was that they were unsure of whether the current model and how they were financing community centers worked, whether these services were really what families needed, how the money is being used. So that was the problem. They were thinking about this other way of managing how they're funding those community centers that I just explained. And then the way that the government was aiming to use blockchain here is because, of course, it ticks the boxes, right? It allows you to know every transaction that is being done, where it is, how it has been done. So they could know better how the money has been used, has been spent, and so on. And of course, this would be in real time because the information would be like on the spot instead of probably waiting for 3 months before you even know how that money was used and by whom. So in this case, I'm going to share with you which were the main institutional barriers that we faced when we were trying to bring blockchain into this equation, right? So the first one is that the government, although the government was excited about using blockchain, at the same time, they were uncertain whether there was already in place in Argentina a regulation framework and legal framework that will allow them to easily get that task done of bringing public funds into the blockchain, right? So that was the biggest question that we were asked to actually have the response for. And here what we did in terms of using strategies is that we tried to break down the problem. And first, of course, you can go over and review regulations and frameworks, but at the same time, you do not have the weight of taking that legal decision. But we did that. Plus, what we did on the side as well was to try to find cases already in Argentina that have already used blockchain by the government. And that actually was the case. So we could prove that the government in like 10 years before has already used blockchain and put public funds within the blockchain to use it for XX. So that's how we went about it, to just prove that this already existed and had a precedent in that country, and it was therefore more doable, or it makes sense to do it again. The second institutional barrier that we face is that the government struggles, although it's excited about having new technology looking more modern, it is also struggling to know that all the power of who can actually run that technology is outsourced and is not necessarily inside the institution. So for that, we wanted to make sure that the relationship between the government and the private sector, or whoever was going to be building the technology and supporting the government, was not only a client sort of relationship, but we invited both parties to actually try to have more of a shared ownership model, where, of course, the government could also participate more closely on what is the architecture of the system. They could also like own bits of that in terms of like the development. So that's the way that we approach this fear of the government of not being able to control this new technology. The third one is that usually the way that bureaucracy works is that is not necessarily meant to allow to quickly pilot and to innovate, but rather it has like a very specific way that procurement goes, that it's hard to find those sweet spots to actually try something out. So for that, what we aimed for in terms of the strategy was to build a roadmap where we could share which were the quick wins that the government will see when they try out this technology. So instead of trying to go against the procurement system, we were trying to say, I'm going to talk more about the benefits that you're going to get from this, and then it's up to you to see how you want to execute it. So we were not really like trying to change the entire way they procure, but rather trying to say, we understand that's a bottleneck. It's up to you to find how flexible that could turn into. And we're going to rather focus on what are the advantages so that you know that this is a good call for you. And for that, we break it into like a timeline and quick wins, 3 months, 6 months, because usually the government is on a rush to show that they're doing the work, that they want to be re-elected most of the time. So they wanted to make sure that you can mobilize the public opinion on their favor. That's the end of our trip. And now I'm going to go on have these reflections about what I just shared. I don't know if we are going to have time to discuss these right now, but anyways, I'm going to go ahead and open the space for a few questions or comments in case there are any. So the first big reflection will be around the blockchain firms. So if you're currently working as a blockchain firm, or those are like your closest partners and allies, this is what you could bring with you, the main takeaway from this conversation. So although blockchain firms excel at tech and the product, it is important that you understand that this solution will arrive in an ecosystem that has a lot of different stakeholders, interests, and information that needs to be sorted out. And that's what I was just sharing before with these 2 cases that I mentioned. So for that, the recommendation would be 2. Either you can literally integrate all of these services that most of the time you have to sort out when you're working with the government. I just gave you a couple of examples. For instance, to understand how to give policy advice, how to better guide the government into the governance of these new models by using technology, to co-design with them, to be able to give them assessment on how you can engage the community with these new technologies and so on. That would be like one way to integrate all those services on the way that you do or how you go about it when you work with the government, especially if the government is your main client. it makes sense at some point to ask you this question as, should I integrate these new services? The other option to that one, because of course this has a lot of implications, cost, and so on. The other option to that one would be to have already an ecosystem of stakeholders that you can quickly tap on and bring them into the equation. Do we need to give the government policy advice? Great. This is the partner that is going to allow me to work on that. What about to engage with the community? Okay, this is the other partner I'm going to bring into the equation. So that would be like the biggest reflection I could share in terms of advice based on the work and the experience that I've had being in those negotiations and trying to understand how we can make it better the next time. So for that, the three key suggestions that you could take with you is, when you have those conversations, make sure that blockchain is vital. This means that without the use of this technology, we cannot sort out the problem. The second thing is that, does really blockchain bring in value, or is it more like a nice way to say that we're being modern and we're excited about it, we're using this technology? What is the real value of using this technology in those cases? How is it like addressing 100% the problem that the governments had? And the third one would be if it's viable. Is it realistic to say that just by tokenizing environmental services, we will raise more funds to protect those areas? Like, how realistic is that assumption? So very quickly jumping and almost ready to wrap up this presentation, I wanted to share with you what would be the advice for the government. And in case that you are already working with the government or you're part of the government, what you could have in your mind. So what we have seen is that definitely governments around the world and different regions, as I mentioned with you, like Middle East, Northern Africa, Eastern Europe, and so on, everyone is super eager to try out new technologies, to be modern, to do the famous digital transition, for sure. The problem is that there is no clarity on what is on the stake when you're trying to actually do that. So for that, the conversations we've had with the governments are especially allowing them to understand that the way that the organization is a structure, where you see like a technical team, meaning whoever runs the subject on itself, and the IT team cannot be perceived as two separate units anymore. When you're talking about a digital transition, you need to reorganize and restructure how the organization works and leverages on technology, and also offers new services. And therefore, they need to rethink how their structure is currently working, and what is the relationship with this use of technology and digital services. So for that, the suggestions is to really invite the government to understand like how they can integrate their teams, especially when you're working already with the governmental institution. You will see that there are a lot of internal clashes within the organization just because the teams are not integrated and they do not perceive themselves as like being part of one piece. The second thing is that, again, although there is a hype for digital transformation, there is no clarity that to bring in a digital tool does not mean that that is going to become into a digital solution. And therefore, we're not really talking about transforming anything, even if you're bringing digital into the equation. So how are you achieving a digital transformation? So we were also having those conversations with the government and trying to invite them to plan bigger and in the long run, because we should switch from the project by project mindset to actually have this long-term digital transformation strategy. And finally, the mid leaders of the organization should definitely understand that technology is not just for the fun of it, but it literally adds a strategic value to the work, to the core value proposition of their mission, of their mandate, of the services that they deliver. So these were all the conversations we were able to have with the government, and are useful to keep them in mind while you're working with them. So I was really excited to share all of these with you all. I hope you enjoy this quick trip to Latin America and all these big reflections and suggestions on how you can go about it. Feel free to get in touch with me. Always eager to keep making my blockchain of practitioners even wider and broader. And I'm not sure if we're gonna have times or not for questions. I think Abel will like let us know. But thank you again on my behalf.